There's a version of you that you've been running from your entire life. A version that holds your rage, your shame, your deepest secrets. The parts you've learned to hide so well that even you forgot they existed. But what if I told you that the key to becoming whole isn't in perfecting yourself, but in embracing the darkness you've been taught to fear? In 1912, a Swiss psychiatrist named CarlJung introduced a concept that would shake the foundations of psychology forever. He called it the shadow, the repository of everything we've ever rejected about ourselves. Not the evil within us, as many misunderstand it, but rather the disowned self. The parts of our personality that didn't receive approval from our parents, our teachers, our society. The emotions we learned were bad. The desires we were taught were wrong. The thoughts we buried so deep we convinced ourselves they never existed. Think about your childhood for a moment. Remember being told to stop crying because big kids don't cry? Remember being shamed for being too loud, too opinionated, too much? Every single time you expressed something authentic and received disapproval, your psyche made a devastating calculation. It decided that survival, being loved, being accepted, being safe, was more important than being whole. So you took that part of yourself, wrapped it in darkness, and shoved it into what Jung called the shadow bag, a psychological container for everything you couldn't afford to be. And here's the terrifying truth. That bag has been following you everywhere. It's been behind every inexplicable outburst of anger. Every time you've sabotaged a relationship without understanding why. Every moment you felt like you're watching yourself make destructive choices but couldn't stop. Because the shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It doesn't fade when you pretend it's not there. Instead, it grows stronger, more desperate, more volatile, until it finds ways to leak out, usually at the worst possible moments. Jung observed something remarkable in his patients. He noticed that the qualities they most despised in others were often reflections of their own disowned traits. A woman who constantly criticizes others for being too emotional might be someone who learned to suppress her own feelings to survive a household where vulnerability was punished. A man who judges people for being weak might be carrying a shadow filled with the softness and tenderness he was taught real men don't possess. This phenomenon is called projection, and it's one of the shadow's most powerful mechanisms. When you encounter someone who triggers an unusually intense reaction in you, a visceral disgust, an irrational anger, a deep resentment, Jung would ask you to get curious. Because that person isn't really the problem. They're a mirror, reflecting back the parts of yourself you've exiled into darkness. The homeless person who makes you uncomfortable might be reflecting your own fear of vulnerability and loss of control. The colleague whose confidence irritates you might be showing you the self-assurance you've never allowed yourself to express. The friend whose selfishness enrages you might be highlighting your own unexpressed needs that you've learned to suppress. But here's where it gets even more complex. The shadow doesn't only contain negative traits. For people who grew up in environments where success was dangerous, where shining too brightly invited punishment, even positive qualities get exiled. Brilliance becomes threatening. Confidence becomes arrogance. Joy becomes selfishness. Jung called this the golden shadow, the positive potential within us that we've learned to keep hidden because expressing it once resulted in rejection, jealousy, or abandonment. Consider Sarah, a talented artist who spent decades working administrative jobs, convinced she wasn't creative enough to pursue art professionally. In therapy, she discovered that as a child, whenever she showed her drawings to her father, he would criticize them harshly, threatened by her talent because his own creative dreams had died. To maintain her relationship with him, to stay safe, young Sarah buried her artistic gifts in her shadow. 40 years later, she was still living a half-life, haunted by a persistent feeling that something essential was missing. The psychological cost of carrying an unintegrated shadow is immense. Jung warned that what we don't integrate, we project. What we don't acknowledge consciously, we act out unconsciously. This is why people who pride themselves on being nice often find themselves in relationships with partners who express all the anger they've repressed. It's why those who see themselves as rational and controlled are often drawn to chaotic, emotional situations. The psyche seeks balance. What you exile doesn't disappear, it just finds indirect ways to live. Shadow work, then, is the courageous practice of turning around and finally looking at what's been following you. It's the process of opening that bag you've been dragging since childhood and examining its contents with compassion rather than judgment. And make no mistake, this is some of the most difficult psychological work a human being can undertake. Because looking at your shadow means confronting the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. It means feeling the shame you've buried. It means acknowledging the anger you've denied. It means admitting to the desires you've judged as unacceptable. The process begins with recognition. Jung suggested paying attention to your projections, those moments when your reaction to someone seems disproportionate to the situation. If you find yourself having intense feelings about another person's behavior, pause and ask, what part of myself am I seeing in them? What am I rejecting in my own psyche? This isn't about blame or shame. It's about reclaiming the energy you've been using to keep parts of yourself locked away. Dreams offer another powerful gateway into shadow work. Jung believed dreams were the psyche's way of communicating what the conscious mind refuses to see. The threatening figure chasing you in nightmares? Often a representation of the shadow aspects you're fleeing from. The monster in the basement? The parts of yourself you've buried in your psychological underground. Instead of waking in terror and dismissing these dreams, shadow work invites you to turn around in the dream, or in your waking reflection on it, and ask, what are you? What do you need? What part of me have I been refusing to acknowledge? Active imagination is another Jungian technique for shadow integration. This involves dialoguing with the parts of yourself you've disowned. You might write letters from your rage, giving it a voice. You might have a conversation with your inner critic, asking where it learned to speak to you that way. You might create art that expresses the emotions you've never allowed yourself to feel. The goal isn't to indulge destructive impulses, but to give them conscious attention so they stop controlling you from the shadows. Here's a crucial distinction. Integrating your shadow doesn't mean acting out every suppressed impulse. A man who discovers his shadow contains violence doesn't start punching people. Instead, he acknowledges the anger he's been repressing, explores where it comes from, and finds healthy ways to access his assertiveness and strength. A woman who finds greed in her shadow doesn't become a ruthless manipulator. She acknowledges her legitimate needs and learns to advocate for herself without shame. Integration means bringing the shadow into consciousness and choosing how to work with its energy. The transformation that occurs through shadow work is profound. People describe feeling more authentic, more alive, more complete. They report that relationships improve because they stop projecting their disowned parts onto others. They find that their creativity expands because they're no longer using vast amounts of energy to maintain their repressions. They discover a deeper sense of compassion, both for themselves and others, because they've faced their own darkness and found it fundamentally human. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. He believed that much of the world's suffering comes from unintegrated shadows. Individuals and entire societies projecting their darkness onto scapegoats, creating enemies to carry what they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. The prejudices that divide us, the conflicts that rage between groups, the cycles of violence that repeat through generations, all of these have roots in collective shadow material that remains unexamined. This is why shadow work isn't just personal healing. It's a radical act of taking responsibility for your psychological life. When you stop projecting your anger onto others, you reduce conflict. When you integrate your shame, you stop passing it to the next generation. When you acknowledge your own capacity for darkness, you become less likely to demonize others. You recognize that every human being carries a shadow, and this recognition breeds humility and compassion rather than judgment. The journey of shadow integration is lifelong. You don't complete shadow work and move on. Instead, It becomes a practice of ongoing self-examination, a commitment to meeting new layers of unconscious material as they emerge. Life will continue to present you with mirrors, relationships, conflicts, reactions that seem disproportionate. Each one is an invitation to ask, what is this showing me about myself? What have I not yet integrated? Modern psychology has built extensively on Jung's foundation. Therapists practicing internal family systems talk about exiled parts that closely mirror the shadow concept. Psychodynamic approaches explore how early relational wounds create splits in the psyche. Somatic therapies recognize that the shadow isn't just psychological. It's held in the body, in chronic tension, in the breath we won't fully release, in the tears we've learned not to cry. All of these approaches share Jung's fundamental insight. Wholeness requires integration, not perfection. What makes shadow work particularly relevant today is our culture's obsession with the curated self. Social media encourages us to present only our highlight reels, our achievements, our most flattering angles. We're more skilled than ever at constructing personas, while our shadows grow heavier, denser, more separate from our conscious identities. The result is an epidemic of people who feel fraudulent, who suffer from imposter syndrome, who can't shake the feeling that if others really knew them, they would be rejected. Because living entirely from the persona, entirely from the acceptable self, creates a fundamental disconnection from your own depth and authenticity. Jung had a powerful vision for what could happen if more people engaged in shadow work. He imagined a world where individuals took responsibility for their own darkness instead of projecting it onto convenient targets, where people could hold both their light and their shadow with equal acceptance, where the integration of the unconscious led not to moral relativism, but to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of human nature. He believed this work was essential not just for individual healing, but for the survival of civilization itself. So here's the invitation. Stop running from the version of yourself you've been taught to fear. Turn around and look at what's been following you. Open the bag you've been dragging since childhood and meet what's inside with curiosity rather than condemnation. Because the path to becoming whole doesn't go around your darkness. It goes directly through it. And on the other side of that courageous journey is a version of yourself you've never been allowed to be. Authentic, integrated, and finally free. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that's been waiting your entire life to come home. And the moment you stop exiling it, the moment you turn and embrace what you've rejected, something extraordinary happens. You don't become darker. You become whole. You don't lose yourself. You find the parts you never knew were missing. And that, ultimately, is what shadow work offers. Not perfection, but integration. Not the elimination of darkness, but the courage to hold both light and shadow in the same breath, in the same heart, in the same beautifully complicated human existence. If this exploration of the shadow resonated with you, subscribe to continue this journey into the hidden dimensions of human consciousness. Like this video if you're ready to stop running from yourself, and comment with your city. Let's build a global community of people brave enough to do the work of integration.